I join you today in the spirit of prayerfulness that has already been invoked at this event. And I say that because it is only within that spirit that we as a country will be able to repair that which has been broken. I want to be president because I want to help this country navigate this time of crisis, help this country put to bed one era of our history and begin a new one. And in order to do that, we need to face the fact that in any time of crisis, there is the opportunity to look at things that have not been looked at, make changes that need to be made, and when you rebuild your house, build it an even better way. The economic issues that have already been referred to here, the issues of missing and murdered Indigenous women, the issues of lack of health care, the issues of unfairly negotiated treaties, the issues of broken treaties, the issues of the Keystone and the Bakken pipelines, so many areas where on an external level there are deep and systemic injustices to be addressed. I'm running for president because if all we do is address those issues on the level of the external, then even when repair is made, repair can then be regressed, issues can be repealed, actions can be undone. I want to help this country reconcile with a horrific chapter of our past. I want our children to be taught what really happened. I want a huge series of conferences and artistic expressions. I want people of the United States to come to understand that what occurred on this planet is one of the great evils of history, but that I believe in redemption for nations as well as for individuals. We can atone. We can make amends. And if and when I'm President of the United States, we will. We will begin by taking that picture of Andrew Jackson off the wall of the Oval Office. I assure you, I am not a Native American woman, but I find it one of the greatest insults. You will not be insulted. You will be more than not insulted. If I am President of the United States, there will be a level of atonement. There will be a level of making amends, yes, on the external levels we mentioned, but also with so many other ways that your people are lifted to the level of partnership that takes us beyond the dominator model of history that white Europeans brought to this continent to begin with. We can begin again, not with white people dominating on any level and fixing what has been broken and telling you what is wrong and learning from you what has been wrong and doing something here to make it different and doing something there to make it different. We will go much further. From the depth of my heart and on behalf of the American people, I will apologize and I will ask your forgiveness and ask you to join in a new era of American history as partners on this sacred land. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. So I'll introduce the panelists as we ask the questions, and we're actually going to start with a panelist who's down here. Marcelo LeBeau will ask the first question. Please.
Thank you for this honor.
Thank you for this honor, ma'am.
I'm glad to hear the words that you spoke. And for Native Americans, especially those of us who live on the Cheyenne River Reservation, we look at the doctrine of discovery starting way back then and the things that have happened to Native American people. And on our reservation, my great-grandfather was one who, we say signed, but he put his mark on the treaty, the Fort Laramie Treaty. And he was given land, an allotment to move on to. That was already our land. That was treaty land. And he had to live there. And if he left, he had to have a signed permit to come and go. Otherwise, he would have been shot as a hostile. And then he had to stand in line for rations for his people. Instead of the role that he played as provider, hunting the buffalo, providing for food and clothing for his people. And I say, how in the world, how humiliating that must have been for him to sit in that role. But he lived by the treaty, and others did not live by the treaty. So our people are affected by all that has happened in the United States of America. And I'm thankful to hear your words, and we'll look forward to that and to your support.
Thank you very much. The story that you just told involves not only deep injustice, but also, as you have mentioned, deep insult and deep humiliation. It was very profound for everyone in this room to hear your words, because you have reached an age, there is a certain point where we all get in our lives, if we're fortunate enough, that we are keepers of the story. There are young people here whose grandfather, I believe you were mentioning your grandfather, it will be so many generations back that they will not have the level of firsthand knowledge that you just displayed. If I'm President of the United States, one of the things that we will have is a great program of video recordings. Your words that you just spoke must be recorded for history. And not just Native American children should hear your words, all American children should hear your words. After part of the reconciliation of the nation of Germany with the Jews after the Holocaust, which in many ways should be a template of our national repair with both Black Americans and Native Americans, has to do with two pieces. Not only economic reparations, but also a promise that in perpetuity, the children of the country would learn the true story of what occurred. And if I'm President of the United States, that will occur. Part of that will be recordings of people such as yourself, ma'am, and this will not only be through colleges, through preschools, not preschools, through our public schools, and through a great way, I believe we should have an entire year of reconciliation where we do everything possible to allow the American people to hear stories such as yours in order that the changes of heart might occur on a mass level. Thank you for the honor of hearing your story.
As part of that, do you think there should be reconciliations in terms of the medals of honor that were given to the service?
Of course, they should be removed and withdrawn. You know, it's terrible to give someone a medal for being a murderer. You don't give someone a medal for being a murderer. But I believe that we must understand that nations grow just like individuals grow. Nations can be redeemed like individuals can be redeemed. And in order for that to happen, we must face the facts, we must face our shadows, we must face our character defects, and we must face the things that must be changed, and that will be part of that. Not blaming those men as individuals, they were all caught within a horrific chapter of history. But yes, it is absolutely important in our time, these medals, that honor must be withdrawn, of course.
Thank you.
These are symbols, but they matter. And that's the whole point here. They matter. They matter.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Colleen Echohawk with the Native Organizing Alliance.
Thank you. It is an honor to be with you. Thank you for being
you.
here. I want to touch on a subject that you've already mentioned, which is missing and murdered Indigenous women. According to the United States Department of Justice, American Indian women are 10 times more likely to be murdered than the national average. 4 in 5 American Indian women will experience violence in their lifetimes. And we see that all over our country. I live in Seattle, where I support American Indian, Alaska Native people who are experiencing homelessness, and we see these high rates of sexual violence with our folks who are homeless. We know that our Native community are more likely to be homeless than anyone else in our whole country. In Anchorage, Alaska, 60% of the homeless population are Native. In Seattle, 10%. Minneapolis, it's 22 times more likely to be homeless. And the missing, murdered, and Indigenous women is completely connected there because we know that that lack of stability of home and housing reverberates through that entire system. And so I just wonder what your response is to, I combine women and missing, murdered Indigenous women with housing and stability, and just some of your thoughts on that.
A term that is often used today is intersectionality. Everything is related to everything. But let's begin with the fact that these problems themselves are but symptoms of deeper cause, a deeper societal dysfunction, a deeper societal breakdown. And the reason why I emphasize spiritual renewal and spiritual healing is because it is on that level of the heart that we will find the inspiration and the motivation and the understanding among the masses of American people that will be necessary to both create and perpetuate the political will necessary to make the changes that must be made. In the meantime, on the level of justice, one of my main focuses in the selection and the guidance of an Attorney General and the Department of Justice will be deep recognition of these wrongs, a deep recognition of the need to give all appropriate police agencies not only the resources that they need, but the direction that must be given, that these are issues that must be given full attention. And I look forward to working with police and criminal justice systems within the Native tribes for their own ideas about how these things are to be done, when it is preferred that the federal government of the United States give money that is to be used by tribes versus when the tribes themselves would prefer that state and federal agencies are involved. In me, you would have a president who is on this, and I am deeply aware that violence against women and girls is one of the most demonic signs of a nation as well as an individual that has lost its soul.
Our next question comes from Marlon White Eagle from the Ho-Chunk Nation.
Yes, my question is regarding health care, in particular mental health. The suicide rate for Native men and women has gone up exponentially in the last 20 years. Right now, Native youth are a third of suicide deaths, and let me see, what's the other one? 25% of Natives suffer from PTSD, and Indian Health Service has provides health care, mental health care, but it's inadequate. And what would you do as, in your administration, how would you address mental health care for Natives and the suicide rate that's rising at an alarming rate?
Whether it is for Native Americans or for anyone else, we have a crisis of mental health care, and obviously many more resources should be given to providing mental health care. But we must go deeper and understand, what have we done that so many people don't even want to be here? We have to address that. We have to address the insanity of our entire social order. And when it comes to Native Americans, as we know, there's the genocide, then there's the cultural annihilation, then there is the geographical displacement, and because of so many of these issues, there is a spiritual displacement. There's a spiritual displacement of all Americans, but particularly one can understand how devastating that spiritual displacement would be to a people who for thousands and thousands and thousands of years found their sanity and their abundance within the space of deep place and deep connection to land and tribe. The devastation, and now what has happened is that when the white European settlers came to this country, what they needed was what they then destroyed. So the aspects of soul, the aspects of place, the aspects of connection to land, the aspects of connection to tribe, the aspects of connection to higher power and God, that which the Native Americans carried, which could have been such a great gift, that which was destroyed, now the white European culture, because the white European culture as it unfolded on this continent did not have those things. Now the white European culture is in many ways falling apart and discombobulating without those things. That's why it's so much more than just saying to Native Americans in some paternalistic way, well, we did you wrong, let us fix it. It is deeper than that. now that we have atoned, now that we have made amends, will you please help us so that not only we are allowing these issues and powers to be resurrected among your people, but hopefully you will help us so that these powers can be resurrected among our own, because there are so many children, not only in your community, but around this country, who simply cannot find a place for their souls to breathe here.
Our next question comes from Shannon Halsley, Stockbridge, Muncie.
Good morning and thank you. Marianne, you sort of expounded on it earlier. You talked about everything being interconnected.
Yes.
You talked about as it relates to jurisdiction, about adjudication. You talked about the protections of missing and murdered Indigenous people. You talked about homelessness, and you also talked about behavioral health. My question is about criminal justice and policing. With that said, American Indians are the most likely group of people to be killed by police. And with that said, we're also some of the highest propensity of people against violence within our tribal nations. With that said, it's extremely complex in terms of us as tribal sovereigns, as how we interact and how we adjudicate those things within our own tribal departments of court and tribal police departments. With that said, we have issues that are intercorrelated to how we do that based on the entanglement of some of the challenges that are placed on us from our federal agencies, and how, as we as sovereign nations, execute and adjudicate those things specifically. So what does your administration plan on doing to assist tribal nations in tackling those jurisdictional and funding issues or problems that are faced both by our tribal courts and by our law enforcement agencies?
May I ask what you were referring to specifically when you talked about challenges put upon you by federal?
Right, because there's legal entanglements associated with as to how we govern. We're self-governed, we're tribal sovereign nations. However, there are jurisdictional issues enjoined to different things, especially as it relates to VAWA and other issues, but how we adjudicate and how people are basically, how they bring crimes to be brought to justice. So with that said, how will you, in your administration, help us assist in doing so?
This afternoon, I will be unveiling a proposal for a United States Department of Peace. And one of the things that I am dealing with in all of this has to do with the fact that we will not be able to counter the violence in our society until we recognize the many ways in which we have become a violent society. It's not just about guns, it's not just about dealing with criminals. It's about dealing with all of the many ways, whether it has to do with environmental violence, whether it has to do with violence in our hearts, whether it has to do with violence in our entertainment, and also has to do with violence within our criminal system, violence within our policing, etc. That is what I feel that I can help inaugurate in this country, is a deep conversation. And once again, this is an area where it's not even about respecting the native traditions. It is about including the native traditions. This is not just about our respecting the way you would do things within your communities. It is about learning deeply what you do in your communities that we should be doing throughout the United States. That's why so much of the work that I want for the United States Department of Peace has to do with conflict resolution, has to do with restorative justice, has to do with what are in some cases ancient modes of healing and repair. Otherwise, what I see far too often, even among the most well-intentioned progressive voices when it comes to all of these issues, is it is still a white European mode of repair. I wish to see a mode of repair that has a deep level of actual respect, where I would be asking you, I would be asking your elders, I would be asking the members of your community, how is this best done for your people, and not only making the space within our own criminal justice system for the level of partnership that is necessary and respect, but also, as I said, learning from you in order that those things might be included in such things as the Department of Peace to bless our entire country.
Our next question comes from Lisa Whitepipe from Rosebud.
Good morning and thank you. I'm very honored to be sitting on this panel today. My question has to do with the environment, and thank you for taking your position in restoring our sacred Black Hills. The Rosewood Sioux Tribe is located in central South Dakota, and while we as nations clearly support economic growth, we do have a different analysis considering the sacredness of our lands. And I'm sure you have seen that at Standing Rock, and it's happening in Hawaii now. And tribes in South Dakota will be facing those same issues with KXL coming in. As president, how will you ensure that the sacred sites are protected and tribes are consulted prior to any development?
There are certain places where we continue to compromise with oil and gas companies, with chemical companies, with other multinational corporate entities whose profitability and short-term profit maximization goals are simply at odds with environmental protection and cultural respect. I will not compromise. Their time is over. We all want for everyone in America to have an opportunity to create wealth, etc., but not at the expense of the values we hold most dear. When it comes to Keystone, when it comes to Bakan, when it comes to Hawaii, when it comes to so many of these issues, when it comes to the Black Hills, it is time to stop talking about it. It is time to fundamentally change. I will not be timid with the use of the power of the presidency. I will use all executive orders and all executive powers given to me. You are citizens of the United States. In addition to that, this is a community that has been wronged. More than that, you are a community whose sacred values and principles are correct. They are in alignment with what our democracy should stand for. They are in alignment with a deep humanitarian respect for people and for planet. I will do more than advocate for you. I will tell all forces who violate those values to get right back where you belong. You do not have the right for your capitalistic concerns to run roughshod over the people and the planet on which we live.
Let me follow up a bit with that. The globe is moving toward the standard of free, informed, prior consent. How do you make that part of the United States DNA?
I'm sorry, because I don't totally understand that question. Free and prior consent, what are you specifically referring to?
Any kind of development requires free, prior, informed consent from the people involved.
Well, what
as
is
a standard.
Right, and what we are dealing with in terms of native tribes here is too many times where the United States government claims a kind of eminent domain. That is wrong. It will stop when I'm president.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Ed Sikakaku from the Ute Business Committee.
Good morning. It's an honor to be here to ask you these questions.
It's an honor
It's
to be
honor
here
to
for
be
me as
before
well.
the people. You have taken a formal position on reparation for African Americans. And on your campaign page, you have highlighted several wrongs which you would correct with regards to Native Americans as well, such as returning sacred land resources back to Native American nations and protecting Native religion, freedom, sacred sites, and stopping the construction in the name of development of all lands encroaching on Native American lands. Also, historic deeds of violence, genocides, and theft are a sad chapter in our shared history, and were inflicted on Native peoples by our own federal government. However, tribes are less comfortable to speak or discuss reparations for tribal nations and prefer to just have their treaties implemented and their homelands restored. How will you balance these desires with your plan with your plans on reparation to right this historic wrongs and the damage it has done to tribal nations?
Well, as you yourself said, the tribal nations themselves have indicated, and I agree, this is not the same situation with Black Americans, where it is a matter of not that it's easy, not that it's small, but there is a simplicity to the idea of economic restitution. When it comes to Native Americans, as you've indicated, this is a more complicated situation. It has to do with treaties that were unfairly negotiated to begin with. It has to do with treaties that have been broken. It has had to do with the federal government doing more to protect and advocate for corporate interests who would exploit the land in the interests of the Native Americans rather than advocating for the Native Americans. It has to do with lack of economic opportunity. It has had to do with the ravages of displacement, not only geographically, but also culturally. And therefore, with reparative measures towards Native Americans, it is more like when you have a chain, and the chain has gotten a lot of knots in it, and you have to take a needle and try to undo it. And a lot of that has to do with listening to the voices of Native American elders and Native American community and to see what the needs are. What I can promise as president, I have a deep understanding, which I hope that I have been able to communicate here today. I have a deep understanding of the larger issue of injustice and the need for repair. I have a deep understanding that it is Native voices themselves who have the greatest wisdom about not only what needs to change, because in many areas, I, as a woman who is not a Native American, can learn what needs to change. That, and I feel to a great extent I have. But how the change would best be accomplished within your community in order to best be in keeping with the long-range plans that you want for how you teach your children, how you carry out your systems of justice, et cetera, I will learn from you, and it will be an honor to do so.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Cedar Fernandez from the Native Organizers Alliance.
So I was wondering, how will you maintain efforts and consistent support by funding our K-12 public schools that primarily serve Native students, as well as our food distribution and healthcare? And what will these frameworks look like?
It would be so wonderful if everything was great for everyone else and we just had this one area, Native American communities, where we needed to address a few things. The problem is so much deeper than that. We have millions of American children. Native American children are among millions of American children who live with chronic trauma. We have millions of American children, including within the Native American communities, who are chronically traumatized before preschool. We have 13 million American children who are food insecure, and that exists also within your community. So what I see in terms of the trauma of Native American children is the furthest continuum of a problem that we have within America. That is why, as president, I propose a United States Department of Children and Youth. I want a massive realignment of our investment in the direction of children 10 years old and younger. I want every school in the United States, I don't care what the neighborhood is, to be a palace of learning and culture and the arts. As I indicated to this woman earlier, I want a far more expansive part of the curriculum of every American child to be deep education about the history of the United States regarding Native Americans. And I promise you, if I'm president of the United States, the very idea that we base the majority of our funding for our schools on property taxes, this is a passive form of oppression. To withhold education from any child in the richest country in the world is a passive form of oppression. The idea that a child grows up in a financially advantaged neighborhood and therefore has a very good probability of a very fine public school education, but that if a child does not grow up in a financially advantaged neighborhood, has a decreased chance of that, is absolutely unacceptable. We have millions of American children, including within the communities where Native Americans live, where children do not even have the adequate school supplies in their classrooms with which to teach a child to read. And if a child cannot learn to read by the age of 8, the chances of high school graduation are drastically decreased, and the chances of incarceration are drastically increased. This must end. And when I'm president, it will.
So to add on to that, I just want to say that, I chose these 3 things because if we don't have, the basics, like food distribution and, health care, mental, physical health, the physical health also affects mental, of course. So, and we don't have, the adequate teaching or resources, it all links together, and if one doesn't work, then it just kind of breaks
That
apart.
is exactly the point. They are all linked together. That is that whole concept of the intersectionality. It is that, you see, ladies and gentlemen, I believe that most politicians have been told by political operatives, don't sound negative. Don't talk about how bad things really are. Be more positive. We will not get to the positive until we face the level of corruption that is existing here. We must. That is why when you go to the doctor, in order for the doctor to heal you, the doctor has to be honest with you if the test results come back and they're not good. And Native Americans of all people, I'm going to pretend to you it's not as bad as it is? I want you to know that in me you'll have a president who's very clear that it's as bad as it is. And very clear that it's not just bad for your community, it is increasingly bad for many, many communities. We need to face it. We need to face it with a level of open-heartedness, compassion for our country. Compassion, we must have compassion for ourselves. We must have compassion for our country as we move through this. But we must recognize that we are passing on to our children the burden of this injustice, the burden of this dysfunction. There is, in many, many respects, in terms of how this economy of our country operates, it is almost as though there is a war on the poor. And for communities among whom there are populations of poverty, this must be addressed with the deepest level of understanding and commitment. And so I'm not someone coming in here and saying, oh, we're going to fix it here, we're going to fix it there, and we're going to have this act over here, and we're going to have this act over there. From the moment I enter into the Oval Office, you will know every single day, I so much more than have your back. I have your children in my heart and in my mind, and in that pen that I'm using to make every executive order and every legislative proposal that is necessary so that America can begin anew.
And our next question comes from Janet David.
It's Janet Davis. I am here and you are here because the presidential elections are coming up. And my question has to do with equal voting access. So our tribe, the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe and the Walker River tribes of Nevada have set the standard in 2016 to equal access to voting for tribal citizens on reservations in the United States. But we had to do that through litigation. 32 miles to go and vote is too far to go and vote. So we won our litigation, and we now have a polling site, early registration voting on our reservation. We also have polling sites on our reservation. Everything the county and the state said we couldn't do, they said that you can't, it's too soon, you can't get enough members in there to go and train to go and be polling workers. Well, we did that. We found young people in our community that were willing to step forward and do that, to be trained to be poll workers. So now for all the voting, we do have the early registration and all of that. So my question to you is, how will you ensure that all Native Americans on reservations have the same access without having to litigate?
And we're also dealing with that situation in North Dakota right now, where there's quite an issue. Let's talk about historically what has occurred here. In 1965, the United States Congress passed the Voting Rights Act. It was specifically in response to the denial of voting rights for Black Americans, but the rights that were protected because of that act applied to all Americans, including Native Americans. In 2013, the John Roberts-led Supreme Court began chipping away at the Voting Rights Act. In the dissent, in her dissent, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg said something very interesting. She said, "Oh, I get it. So it's been raining. We had an umbrella. We haven't been getting wet because of the umbrella. And now you're saying, let's get rid of the umbrella. We don't need it anymore." She said, "It'll rain." And what she predicted is what has happened. All of these efforts at voter suppression are a direct result of what has happened because of the chipping away of the Voting Rights Act in 2013. Now, that was a Supreme Court decision, but we can override the more nefarious aspects of it. Number one, through a president and a presidential administration and direction given to the Department of Justice. One of the main pillars to me in the selection of an attorney general will not only have to do with racial injustices, will not only have to do with white crime, but will have to do with specific attention to voter suppression. This is another area where we should not kid ourselves about the depth of corruption that is occurring here and why. We are living now in the year 2019 as we enter into the main thrust of the 21st century. There is a deep, deep, deep philosophical battle between the forces of exclusion and the forces of inclusion. The forces of inclusion are those of us who find it fascinating and wonderful and culturally rich and important for the world that we are many diverse cultures, that we are many different peoples, and we can have respect for all of them, and they can come together in a great panoply of creativity, even in the areas such as the white European culture with Native American, where repair must be made. But there are forces of exclusion. They are simply the legacy of the same forces of exclusion which had slavery and the genocide of Native Americans hundreds of years ago. It is no longer thank goodness, it is no longer an overt and violent perpetration of horror, but there are underlying continuations of that same exclusivity, of that same sense of entitlement by one people at the expense of others, that is a same sense of legacy of the old aristocratic paradigm that theoretically this country was founded to repudiate. We repudiated it in our original document of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, and it is time to repudiate it again. Not only is this country founded, and we must as a generation, as Americans, now we're all Americans here, and we must rebond emotionally and psychologically with the principles of the Declaration of Independence, because the Declaration of Independence is America's mission statement. All men are created equal. God gave all men inalienable rights of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Governments are instituted to secure those rights, and when government's not doing its job, it's the right of the people to alter it or abolish it. We're not here to abolish it, but darn right, ladies and gentlemen, I am here to alter it. We will stand in our generation and in our time for an America where the idea that all men are created equal does not just mean men, it also means women, does not just mean some people, it also means all people, and that will be codified. If all of those principles are simply on marble walls or written on parchment, but no longer inscribed on our hearts, then they lose their moral force. Principles are dead if they're not alive in our hearts, and that's why I want to be president, because it is time for a great uplifting of consciousness among the American people, a time to rebond with these principles so that we can say, and we mean it. It was already said here, before I came onto the stage, it was already spoken by one of your leaders, that this is a time for the Native American community, as it is time for all Americans, not just to complain about the power that we do not have, but own the power that we do have. When enough Americans vote, Native American and otherwise, then all of the nonsense we have spoken about today will stop, because we the people will demand what we want. Thank you.
I agree. Thank you.
Thank you. In the script, we have now a time for you to give a summary, but it's hard to beat that.
Thank you. It is time for a new chapter of American history. It is time for us to do some very important, deep, and powerful repair work. It is repair work that must be done on the outside, and it is repair work that must be done on the inside. One of the things that we have seen in this presidency is that the consciousness of the president matters. The consciousness of the president has not just visible effects, but invisible effects. We all know that it is time to replace President Donald Trump. And my commitment is the commitment of so many millions of us. It is critically and urgently important that he be defeated at the polls in 2020. But ladies and gentlemen, in many ways, Donald Trump didn't create the deeper problems. The deeper problems created Donald Trump. We must do more than not fall over the cliff. We must get out of the vicinity of the cliff. Donald Trump is not just a politician, he's a phenomenon. And I do not believe that he will be defeated by an insider politics game. He will be defeated by a phenomenon of equal power. And that phenomenon that will defeat Donald Trump is not an individual. The phenomenon that will defeat Donald Trump is an uprising of consciousness among the American people, an awakening among all of us, a spiritual and moral as well as political awakening among all of us. It will inspire us not only to say no to what needs to be said no to, but to say yes to what we know can be. When you speak, as you speak within your tribe so eloquently about honoring your ancestors, about hoping for a better time, absolutely it's time for a better time, and we ourselves must now invoke it. I hope that you will join with me in order that we not only end certain systemic injustices that must be said no to, but in order that we might harness the powers within ourselves to rise up, not just in hope, but in conviction, not just in hope, but in certitude, not just in hope, but in absolute knowledge. Our time has come. We will express it with our voices. We will teach it to our children. We will display it at the voting box. And on the day of our death, we will know we, in our time, did our part. Thank you very, very much.